very sleepy. Do you want me to do something with this?
Fantastic.
This seems unfair.
Thank you so much for being here. If it's okay if I start off with some initial questions, I'd like to ask how you came to know Bhanu and Bhutu and a bit of the getting to know them and focusing on these two girls. And was it difficult to gain consent to film them?
How I met them, I went ahead of Orlanda. So I arrived in Delhi and went down to her training centre, and it was halfway through the film that her job completely changed, actually. So the first half, she was responsible for training in the centre, and it was only on my, I did 2 or 3 trips over, 3 trips in all, and it halfway, I went ahead of her, arrived at the training centre, and she was having to give various lectures and do sort of management stuff, and I started snooping around, as you do, and immediately, and Bhanu just came up to me, and we just formed a connection then and there. And Bhutu was her best friend from her neighbouring village, and they were just wonderful. I actually spent time with quite a few of the girls, but and went to various other villages to film as well, but those two stuck it. And in terms of permissions, well, I guess that's a really difficult question, because in one way I probably have no permission to do anything. On the other hand, I mean, when you say consent, I mean, they gave their consent. Their thing was they didn't want their friends to see it in their villages, but that was all. So they were very happy and delighted, and were brilliant and very cooperative, and got what the whole thing was about. But in terms of kind of real consents, I don't know, we'll see. I mean, it depends from what point of view you're asking, I guess.
And when you started filming in the factory, in both the factory and the hostel, did you have an impression at any point that you're coming in with a camera and your presence there changed the way their policies were carried out or the way the girls were treated?
No, not at all, because the story that Orlanda and I cooked up was that I was following 2 of her girls to really do a kind of study of their organisation. And then the other, we came up with sort of various stories as we went along, and the other was I was making a film only about her, Orlanda, and her work, i.e. we weren't sort of trying to reveal anything. They were very welcoming. I mean, after the filming of the bosses in the factory, there was a massive clampdown. So there were 2 or 3 clampdowns at various points, but on the whole, I did have free reign, and everyone got very used to me just being there with the camera. It's a very small camera. It's not too big.
And going back to Orlanda and her work, it becomes evident in the film that for a time, a lot of the responsibility in enforcing the girls' rights or making sure that they're met, the responsibility falls on her. Can you speak a bit more about her relationship within GTET and what her power was within that company, the intermediary between the corporation and
absolutely. And I think that's sort of a key thing missing in the film is who she's working for. And her bosses, who you meet in the restaurant right at the end, who look like kids. I mean, they're much younger than she is, and the guy that found her is, they had a very close academic relationship, and I think they knew each other through her work as an academic, and suggested that she went to Orissa and started this work. And she's been working in the garment sector for quite a long time. In various aspects of it, and she was very interested. It felt to me that everything, they were kind of making it up a little bit as they went along, but they were very impressed with the work she was doing and
And was Orlando concerned at any point that by that going to a lawyer and raising these concerns about the women's rights would jeopardize within the company of what's happening to the girls at the time that the film was finished? But I was curious if there were any updates since the film was finished, if the marriage took place, and what the girls are doing now.
It swapped. So Bhanu has now gone into education and Bhutu got married. And that's all I know. And my source I have sporadic contact with because I communicate with them directly. But that's what I've heard. And it's, you know, and I feel torn about that. If I just lost the thing. I feel torn about that. Because there are other factories and other working situations that were far better than that one, and you feel that there might have been a kind of liberation for them somewhere. But yeah.
Shall we open it up to audience
sure.
questions? If you'd like.
I lost my mic.
So I'll start in the back, and then we'll work our way to the front.
Thank you very much for your film, which was very sympathetic. And I'm afraid I'm a person with lots of stereotypes in my mind. But in a way, you did hear the girl's story, which was very good. But you know, people work terribly hard in these factories and so on, and somehow that didn't seem to come across so much. And I wondered why, and it's really not a question for you, why your sister's organisation didn't train people for something other than working in a textile factory, because you know, she seemed quite sympathetic to people's rights and so on, and it seemed wrong to train people just to do sewing and things. You know, I found that quite sort of baffling about the whole film. Would you think they were overworked or not, the girls?
Yeah, without doubt. But I think, firstly, these are all college failures, the kids, so they haven't completed their education, and which means that within that context, I suppose they're not much good for anything apart from marriage or labour in the fields, some of the villages I was going to. So the opportunities for them are very, you know, which seemed amazing because both of them are so smart, but, you know, they're dropouts. So it's specifically a programme for dropouts. And the intention is to get them some kind of education alongside, but I think that's probably a wild dream, I don't know. In terms of the working hours of the factory, yeah, it's tough hours. The post-Rana Plaza, they've cleaned up so massively that actually they do pass all the social audits, and it's I think it's the second biggest factory in India, that one. It's a huge, and it's got very, very big Western brands. And they're obviously very paranoid about any negative media, but even though it sounds tough, and when you hear the girls talking about it, it passes.
Thank you for the movie, but it's incredibly inspiring in terms of seeing things on the ground, in terms of what's actually happening. But it's also very, very sad to see two young women forced between two very, very difficult life choices. But what's even worse is that we're living in the 21st century, and with the amount of media coverage in terms of what's happening, that these factories ultimately are fulfilling a demand for global institutions. And these institutions are basically kind of completely blind intentionally to not see what's happening on the ground. How do global, let's say, human rights organizations, etc., kind of put these situations in the forefront and try to affect change? Because it's incredible that this type of stuff is still happening. I mean, we're ultimately kind of purchasing all of these products.
I don't think it's incredible that this is happening at all. You know, of course it's happening. It's happening everywhere. It always has done. This is what I think becomes very interesting, the dialogue between, you know, the West and Orlanda, who sort of has, you know, she's been there so long now, so she couldn't understand when I had any shock at all, because her thing is, well, hello, this is what it looks like. And of course we all really know what it looks like, but we're not having to look at it very much on our own doorstep. Of course, all of the brands know exactly what's going on, all the companies, but they're totally motivated by profit, so it's not, they're not going to, the only thing that changes anything is a media scandal. So in one way, I did feel it was quite exciting to have something potentially that could be used against these corporations, but then it's my sister's job on the line, so that's obviously very problematic. I don't know. I don't think. I know a catastrophe changes things. So post Rana Plaza, everything's cleaned up a lot. Media scandals. So there was a Primark panorama that changed things a lot. But even then, there was a huge backlash, and I believe that Primark were able to sue the BBC because it was in a tiny little sweatshop, and rather than children sewing on sequins in the factory, it was actually in a mother's home in a sort of shed, etc., etc. And also these guys can take out anyone with their legals. If you try and take on they're very, very powerful. So
try and affect that through the kind of, let's say, policy side, government policy. Because you're not going to take them through the normal kind of, let's say, junctures. You need to, let's say, kind of create a lobby in terms of where people who feel concerted about what's happening or feel concerned, that they can start to kind of address this on a more political aspect. Because that's the only way things are going to be changed. Because corporations ultimately will throw tons of money, because they're making so much money in the back of it through lawyers. As you rightly said before, in terms of finding a left-wing lawyer is incredibly rare.
I don't know. Have a go. But what we're so stuck in, and I just watched a film before I came here on the garment sector. I can't remember its name, escapes me, but it's the one that's doing a big round at the moment. And the thing is, it's not the garment. It's every aspect of our life is like this. So if either we're kind of throwing out the whole thing, or we're all partaking in it. That's how I sort of see it. And so, I went to Channel 4 News this piece, and they were very interested on the story of the brand, and felt that the idea of locking the girls up was a potential Rana Plaza catastrophe, because you've got fire regulations, and you've got girls not being able to get out of fire escapes, and black gas cylinders, as Orlanda said, which is terrifying. But in the end, that became slightly daunting for me, because it's my sister. But I don't know how much lobbying. I think media coverage does shift things, but does it? I don't know. This is a question for. I definitely have shifted my position as a result of making this film, put it like that.
I saw another question in the back, and then I'll move toward the front.
Hi, thank you, Chloe. I was just going to ask a question about actually the interaction that people were having to your sister as a white woman. I was wondering, because they seemed quite reverent towards her at points, like, you must be doing quite well in your work because these women are coming to visit you. Do you think that you'd have had any interaction like that at all if you'd have been, I don't know, someone who was local or someone who wasn't white? If you hadn't been a white filmmaker and your sister hadn't been a white woman?
No, you get away with everything being white, because there is, as you say, a sort of reverence. So the two of us together, you can film anywhere more or less. Activists, there's a lot of anger and a sort of, I guess, post-colonial anger, but that's very rare. According to Orlanda, that's far stronger in Bangladesh. But on the whole, you're right. But it's such a the way that the two sisters spoke about their skin color, there's such a anti-dark thing going on. The paler you are, the higher up you are in the hierarchy. And it's, I guess, a very sort of racist place in some ways. And I guess, you know, I was really interested in asking this question of Orlanda as well, because obviously, you see the response that people have to you, and I could see the response that people would have to her. Her line is that if you speak the language, it sort of breaks down those boundaries very quickly. I don't know whether that's true or not. But you're right. I mean, that's very much what's going on. So it became incredibly easy, for instance, to use that to my advantage with the factory bosses, because we were treated as special guests. You know, all the tea and the cake and everything comes out. And then I just say, oh, can I pick up my camera, please? And I filmed that meeting. Now, there's no way that meeting should have been filmed. And in a way, that's probably the best. I'm quite proud of that bit of filming, because I think it gets to the nux of what the whole issue is about. You know, are young women property of families who have no sort of autonomy, or are they should they be given the freedoms that everyone is entitled to? And it's sort of, but I'm glad, you know, that was an example of feeling very good about using that, using whiteness to an advantage, I guess.
More questions on this side? I think I saw some questions on this side.
Thank you for the film. I thought it was enlightening. And I had a question about, it was about the lawyers talking about various legislative frameworks that govern, you know, like bonded labour and things like this. And when you're in practical negotiations with the factory bosses who maybe aren't aware of the legislation or don't recognise it, in that case, how do you start talking about the rights of girls like this and the rights of the people who are working
with
there?
the factory bosses?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's a really good question, because I would sort of say to Orlanda, well, look, we've got it. It's bonded labour. Let's take it straight to the factory. And her line was no, because I'll get booted out within seconds and nothing will change. So I need to find a way of sticking with this so I can shift things, I can get their freedoms, we can work on it, we can expand the programme, we can do it across Bangalore. If we can persuade this particular factory that's the second most, biggest factory in India, then we can work with other factories, etc., etc., if the brands are made aware of it. So that was her, and she did on 2 or 3 occasions address it. And they all sort of go, yeah, we all know it's really dodgy, don't we? And there's a kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink about it. And at which point, you know, my blood would raise. But actually, I think she's right. And the argument that we have, which is really difficult to watch in a way, and it's cut because there was much more bits I had to take out to protect her sort of visa there and stuff like that. But it's, you know, her position is, yes, there's so much of this that's very sort of murky, but if I wasn't doing it with some of these, you know, it's going to be Teja, it's going to be that other guy, and he really was locking the girls up. He was he was behind making sure all of those girls in the hostel, we see all of the gates are closed, including the roof. You know, and if a fire's going off, that's, you know, 200 burnt young women. So I don't know. It was never, it's raised and it's not raised. The only point, she had a big meeting with one of the brands in Delhi, and I really wanted to film it, obviously, and couldn't. But I filmed the meeting beforehand, so when they're in the restaurant, they're actually going off to meet the big brand to discuss some of these issues. And she did raise in that meeting that they were being incarcerated illegally. And one woman turned to her colleague and said, "Is that?" She'd been flown over from America, and she just said, "You know, is that really so?" And he goes, "I don't think we know about it." And there was a kind of brushing off. And I was delighted that was brought up, because there was no going back on it, and then you've kind of got them. And we had recorded it. She went in, you know, but then I think she felt that this can only really come out when she's out. And as long as she's still working within the system, you can't bust it, because she might have much more work to do, or more, you know, she might be able to make more of a difference. I don't know.
Yes, question in the front.
I got a question about the parents. I was thinking maybe they actually wanted their daughters protected. I mean, locking them up, and I mean, maybe something might have happened to them if they had gone out into the city, and maybe, you know, Bangalore might be a dangerous place for very young girls to go.
Yeah, well, as we know, there's a whole spate of rapes of young women all over India, and there had been a few in Bangalore, and that does get to everyone. You know, everybody knows about that, the huge rape in Delhi that the film was made about. So yes, I think that's there's a you know, there's a sort of real fear, and it's very difficult to unpack because it's all part of a sort of, I guess you could argue, a sort of quite patriarchal way of looking at, you know, women. But it's a self-perpetuating problem, isn't it? Because then, as she points out in that meeting. So when you hear the security man talking about them as his daughters, in one way, part of me is horrified and part of me quite loves them for it.
Didn't your sister, she wasn't worried at any point that something might happen to
Yeah, and then she'd be in a hell of a lot of trouble, and that was raised all the time. So she was always arguing with her bosses about this, and they were always on the parents' side as far as they're concerned. But just actually, a friend at the back said, "How old are they?" These girls are over 20. Okay, they are not children. So we need to get that. I think so. But I don't know, you know, because I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
If I can just quickly, to follow up on your earlier mention of Orlanda's visa and the necessity to be responsible for her position within the company. You've said that one of the best ways to approach this issue is to cause a media scandal. And so I wanted to ask if other filmmakers are interested in approaching this topic. Do you think that they would be able to gain the same amount of access that you were able to gain with Orlanda, because it's so impressive to be able to enter the factories and have that kind of access? Do you think it's possible for other filmmakers to do this?
It's incredibly difficult, and getting access to the hostels, which was the sort of last remaining, you know, big bad. Part of the hostels are so far away, and they're down these windy, sandy tracks and very hidden, and you wouldn't know. And you have to be inside the organisation to find things like that. And I did speak to a few journalists, and I spoke to the lawyer about that, and she said nobody's been able, we all know this is going on, but nobody's been able to yet uncover that. So I think and they're really paranoid. I mean, obviously, quite understandably. I did a bit of secret filming in the factory itself, but otherwise there's no way you can go anywhere with a camera, and you have to be very careful. But then again, you know, people say that, but if you've got a sort of iPhone 6 or something, I guess you might be able to do something, but access is obviously very difficult. So I think I did have incredibly privileged access.
Hi, I'm to know how, if at all, you think you might have approached this film differently if it wasn't your sister involved.
I don't think I would if my sister hadn't been involved. I'm interested in what we do. I'm interested in kind of exploring aspects of the West or my heritage, and I'm not interested as a white Londoner to go and make films about, you know, Indian people. That's there. You know, there's enough Indian filmmakers, and there are enough people who can do that. So for me, it's absolutely essential that I would never have gone there to make that film without her. It's because I wanted to explore partly initially why she was living there, because we're quite, you know, we haven't really lived together for 15, 20 years, and we're very close. I mean, in that slightly, the first line in the voiceover is a bit of a sort of wind up, because we are very close and we get on very well, and it was a fantastic trip we made together. And she afterwards asked me, because she suddenly got cold feet, and said, could I not just make it about the girls? And I was very clear. I said, I'm not here to make films about village workers in India. You know, I want to make. My interest in this is because you are here, and it's a Western brand that, you know, it's. So, I don't know if that answers that question, but I don't know.
Thank you. I just had a comment, because obviously the film focuses on the corporate aspect of this, but I think there's probably more to the puzzle and more questions to ask. It's to your point about lack of alternatives for the girls, where they come from, and also I think there's questions around demand for cheap goods and fast fashion. I think there's more players in the chain other than just kind of, I think. And so it's just kind of your thoughts on that, really.
On how many players there are?
Yeah, because I think the film rightly focuses on corporate, and it's a very big piece of it. For consumers, there's questions for lack of alternatives in villages. There's a lot more to it, I think. And
Of course, yeah.
it was just really a comment around that, and yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, just an immediate response is just relaying some of the responses I had. I mean, of course, you know, the village life is desperate, especially for young women. When you see two bright, really, like Bhanu and Bhutu, I wanted more than anything for them to get the hell out of the village. I found Bhanu's mother really irritatingly oppressive. It's like, because her life's fucked, you want to fuck your daughter's lives. Like, you know, it brought out all of, you know, my kind of, I just wanted her to have the same opportunities that young Indian boys would have, for instance, who can all leave the family very early and go off to the big cities. So that plays in, and then you feel incredibly protective about them, the receiving end of you know, the exploitation they're on, but also there's a life they could lead there that maybe could be good. I don't know. I mean, people say that liberation for women in this country really happened when everybody had to go to the ammunition factories during the war. You know, it's economic independence that is the first liberator. And even if you're only, I mean, Orlanda's line would be, you know, okay, you start on $2 a day, and then you leave that factory, you find another one, you join a union, local workers get much more, you get sussed about living in the city, you find your way. Then we did see some, especially local brands, actually, it's the Western brands that were really hideous, who were paying much more, who were much fairer. So there's that story. Then obviously there's the story of all of us. I mean, exploitation's been going on, you know, it's gone on forever, hasn't it? So, and we're all, I just find it very difficult to point to any one aspect. But I'm sure, I mean,
I really just wanted to pay you compliments, but I do have a question at the end of it. Chaplin made Hard Times. I mean, there have been people making films that are very political for a very long time, and it hasn't solved the problem. You've gone right to the heart of this in a mass society with agribusiness moving in on it, and this is going on in China. There are these struggles between rural and city there also. And I think what you brought to it is a texture, a sensitivity about Indian life, which took it to another place than Times is, for example. Actually,
to answer, and you should challenge that.
bosses, because, you know, how much did she believe the Sloan management empowerment discourse in relation to this question of, you know, she was being brought in, you know, to make smart new arrangements that would, you know, get the 40% back up to 90% or something. I mean, that she was in that sense being exploited by a discourse that she
There
sort
was
of believes.
Yeah, no, very much so. And it was I mean, half the time we both laughed. We called it the Muppet Show, her organisation, because I mean, I've worked not very many organisations, but a few in my time, and you get to know which ones are Muppet shows and which ones are sort of vaguely efficient. And it seemed to me to be absolutely all over the place. She went through a huge shift, and I don't know, there's a scene where we went to see the first lawyer in Bangalore, and he more or less said, get out of this office. You know, what you're doing is absolutely despicable. Foggy line, right?
We have time for one more question. I know you've had your hand up.
Hello, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you said in terms of conversations with Channel 4 News. This is very much the sort of thing that they would be interested in, and stuff.
I know The Guardian are doing a piece on it. I mean, I don't know. They do these short pieces, yeah. But just quickly to go back to what you were saying about Channel 4, it became, I think they were only interested in a current affairs story, and I felt that wasn't right for this film, because actually it's not a sensationalist current affairs story, it's a much more subtle story. And it's difficult to know which side of the fence you're on. A straight current affairs story, we're always looking at appalling atrocities. This isn't news. So I guess I did feel that it would compromise it like that.
Well,
Finished.